It's day 3 of our Crochet Beginners Bootcamp, and I'm Siona, your crochet mentor, here today to cover rows. And I'll just make sure I've got my Facebook group set up. I hope you're all doing well. Now, I noticed, and thank you to Pamela for highlighting that she hadn't been receiving emails. So I don't know what happened with my email sequences, but some of you were not getting them, so I have added you to the sequence this morning. So if you're getting them out of sync, that is why. So you will get all the emails if you had previously missed out. You shouldn't get them twice if you'd already had them, but yeah, so apologize for those of you that have been missing out, but everything is in the group and you'll now get them. So you can make sure you save them, drag them across if you're on Gmail, drag them across to your inbox if they're going to your updates or promotions tab. I know mine do quite often with some of my people that email me, so just ensure that. But anyway, all right, so today we're going to cover rows. So what we're going to cover is the basics, turning chains, increasing and decreasing again, getting a straight edge, troubleshooting and reading a pattern in the rows. Now, I think rows are much simpler than rounds, but then they can also be tricky in that it's very easy. I think one of the most common mistakes I see is people losing stitches. So if you look at these, you can see the edges are quite straight. If you start to see them going in at one side or in like that, then you're most likely losing stitches, and it's very, very easy to do. So I'm just going to let my cat out now as well, because he decided he wanted to be in the room, and now has decided that he does not. So let him out. I'll actually take my jumper off too. So anyway, I'm here. All right, so working in the rows. Now, the basics, you're always going to end up with the same number of stitches. So even if you're increasing and decreasing, your stitch number doesn't change unless you are wanting to add shape to your work. And if you're adding shape, then you will, of course, increase and decrease on purpose. So you might add shape if you're making pieces for a jumper, for example, or a top, shaping around the armholes, that sort of thing. Though you'll find you can make a top just out of a rectangle, so don't think that you have to shape. Now when you're working, I'll just start a small piece. You're going to want turning chains. So I sort of touched on it a little bit on day 1, but I didn't get into it in great depth because I didn't want you worrying about turning chains when you are first starting out. So when you're starting and you've got a base chain, they'll always tell you to add extra. Now the adding extra stitches is because they'll try often make the chains that you skip become one of the stitches. So for example, turning chains, so if you're doing a pattern in single crochet, your turning chain will always be a chain 1. Half double crochet, usually a chain 1 or a chain 2 as well, though I do a chain 2 generally. And for double crochet, it'll be a chain 3. And the main reason for that is just to give the height to the stitches. So if you're not doing a turning chain and you're just going straight into the stitch, you're going to find that edge will squish down. So it's really just to get the height. So if I'm going to make this with double crochet, now working into the chain, I tend to work into the bump. So with double crochet, if my turning chain is going to be 3, then you would work into the 4th chain from the hook. Now there is another trick to the turning chain. I'll show you these here as well. So if you're making it to the height of the stitch, so you're going to count it as a stitch. So with a double crochet, it would be a chain 3. Then you would work into the next stitch when you're working across. The other trick you can do is you do a turning chain that is slightly smaller. So instead of a chain 3, you would do a chain 2. So it gives you the height, but then don't count it as a stitch, and your work still into that first one. So you can see I made these swatches ages ago to show getting straighter edges, and I find you don't necessarily get a straighter edge because you can see they're both, this one actually seems more wonky, but you do lose that gap that you see there, which I think bothers quite a lot of crochet, especially when you're first starting out and you're noticing that. I'm never that bothered by them anymore because especially most things that you're working in rows, you're going to either join or add a border, so that all kind of disappears in the end. So I'm not really as bothered. All right, so this one, so the first one I'm going to make it that I'll work into the chain 4. So then I've got to turn over to see the bumps. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, because I prefer to work into the bumps, which of course does make it a little bit more difficult, but it means that you end up with that straight edge, which again, if you're adding a border, doesn't really matter. So if you are popping in and watching live, do say hi. If you're on the replay, let me know that as well. All right, so I'm just working into that bump. If you find it super hard to get into, so your tension's a little bit tight, then you can make, I would recommend going up a hook size for your starting chain. I have learnt just to be even more relaxed with the chain, so it's not so difficult. Sometimes it depends on the yarn, because you'll find acrylic yarn can be a little bit easier to work into sometimes than a cotton, because cotton does have a little bit more tension behind just the yarn itself. I'm just going to work into this. I probably should have picked a quicker stitch, but anyway. All right, so your turning chains, if I get to the end ever, I should have remade this first. All right, so your turning chain, depending on the stitch you're doing. So as I've mentioned, single crochet, just chain 1, and if you're not going to count, if you're doing the turning chain that you're not going to count, then I just don't add the turning chain for the single crochet. It is a short enough stitch that you can get away with that. What have I got here? Oh, I should put this where I can read it better. Does that say, sorry, it's coming up as Facebook user. Does it say Pre? Hello. All right. Sorry, I think I need to get my eyes checked again. Some reading things is a little bit difficult in the distance. All right, so turning chain. So we got to the end. Now, for those of you that, you'll probably find it easier not to lose your stitches when you're, so you can either do the turning chain and turn, or you can turn and do the turning chain. There's no right or wrong way for that. Now, what you're going to be looking for though, so if I'm doing a chain 2 just to get the height, then I will work into this first stitch. So that one was a chain 2, so I'll work into that first stitch. If you're going to do a chain 3, so you are going to count it as a stitch, then you would work into that next one. So let me get it a bit closer. So this is the first stitch. So when you're working in rows, the part you're going to work to is to the yarn hand side of the stitch. You'll see a little sort of lumpy bumpy hole. It becomes obvious. So that one I've just worked into the first stitch, and then there's your second stitch. So if you're doing a chain 3, you're going to count it as the stitch. Now you'll see at the end, especially on the first one, if you're counting, so I worked into that fourth one, so that chain, it tends to sort of drop and disappear, and that's when people start to lose their stitches. So if you find it difficult to find that last stitch, then I would do the chain 2 turning chain, and then like I just did for this one, and then you're not counting the chain 2, but the stitch stands up better. So if I get to the end of the row, so I'll do a chain 2 here, work into that first stitch, and then work my way across. Then you'll find that that stitch at the end, see it's standing up better than it is for this one, which is kind of, words. I refer to that as kind of ducking down. So the stitch always looks like it's ducking down. So if you can be aware of it and remember that it's there, then you'll be okay. But if you're one that's, you know, likely to forget, then I would do the chain 2 and then add the thing. Another option you can do is a single crochet and a chain 1 if you're doing a double crochet, and that will end up making it look a little bit fatter than the turning chain, and so it'll be less gappy at the end of the rows. All right, just get to the end there so you can see. So you could, if you didn't want to do the turning chain as a, like the buffer, think of it. So this one, so that's working into the last stitch, but then you've got to remember that you've got that turning chain hanging down there. So you're going to have to find that and work into it. So it kind of pulls up a little bit, but you can see it disappears. So it's very, very easy to lose that stitch. Okay, so I've worked into that one. Ends up being a little bit curled up at the corner there as well. But you can see that you've got the height there. So this is the chain 2, so you don't need to work into that. So it's much easier to not skip. But if you did want to, you could add a stitch marker. I don't add the stitch marker. I tend to just remember to look for it, because then that'll remind you that you've got to work into that stitch as well. Okay, but I just get annoyed with them being there when I get to the end, so I don't do that. Now, even when you're increasing and decreasing, you're going to want to have the same number of stitches. So if you look, when you're reading the pattern, you'll see that the same number. So if you're decreasing, so if we wanted to turn this into a zigzag, you would work, you could skip a stitch, or you could work across a couple of stitches and turn it into one, but you would still need to keep overall the same number so that you get the straight edges. Otherwise, you're going to end up with it moving in, so you don't want to do that. Okay, so you can always check your stitch count. You can, if you need to, who else has popped in here? Oh, it's not showing me there. You can, if you need to, put a marker. Chantel, hello. Marker. If I was going to, I'm not very good at remembering to use stitch markers, but if you've got a long one and you're worried about losing stitches, then you can put a stitch marker around the post on like every 10th or every 20th. I do recommend it if you've got a pattern with a bit of a stitch repeat that you might mess up the counting, then you can just add it. And I add it around the post so it's out of the way when you're actually crocheting, but it saves you counting. So then you can just check between the blocks if you've got all your stitches, and it makes it a little bit easier to keep track. I don't count really above 12. 10 is usually the highest I'll count, and I'll just keep repeating counts of 10. Now, as I said, there's not really much to working in rows other than remembering to count your stitches. If you do end up losing stitches, I wouldn't stress too much. It's easy to add a stitch to the end, so you can always add in or even add it somewhere in the middle, and that will just very simply even it back out again. So if I missed one at the end of the next row, I would add 2. I've certainly done it. And when you're adding borders to things, honestly, no one's going to notice. Once things are in use, you're really the only one that's going to notice. So the only other thing we've got left to cover here is your patterns. So let me find it in the sheet. So I've got an example of one in the day 3 one. So when you're reading, I need that as my pointer. So when you're reading in rows, so again, you read it in the direction that you're working. What if after 5 rows you realize it's longer? Longer, so as in wider, you've got more stitches that way. You can just you can do 2 stitches together. If you wanted to do that, you can just drop a stitch. It's the same thing. Touch the angry button. Please disregard. Oh, I didn't even notice. It's okay. Oh, I see it there. You can change it. If you go over it again, it changes it to another one. So if you do have too many, like, you can just drop at the end. It's, again, no one's going to notice. Or you could do 2 stitches together. So like that. So if you're doing double crochet, and then that just turns it into one, and that'll bring it back together as well. So that's another option. So you can just continue. No one will know, it'll bring it. So you can see that's 2 double crochets together, and that will bring it back. Yeah, good question. I tend to not fudge if I don't need to. You're welcome. Yeah, I don't pull things back. Even I've got a scarf, it's my macaroon whirl, that was one that had like 3 or 4 rows, and then there was a row where you combined rows together, and I missed some of those. I just used yarn to tie it together. I didn't go back and undo it. All right, so when you're reading a pattern, now these ones get a little bit tricky to read, but some similarities. So the stitches are all there. So in this one we've got chains and double crochets, the UK trebles. You'll see, like when we worked in the rounds, if you remember that chart, the numbers all sort of went up the middle and we were always reading in the same direction. Now with rows, they can't turn the picture. So what you're going to have to remember is that you're going to have to read it in the opposite direction if you're working the rows. So where the row starts will always have the number. And usually you can pick it out by the chain 3s as well. So you can see with this one, you got the chain 3 or whatever the chain number is for that particular one. And you can switch that out. So if you wanted to do the chain 2 instead, or the single crochet with a chain 1, you can just switch that out. There's no bother with that. So you can work, so you can see this one, see how they're alternating? It's because this is the end of the row. So this one you would read back this way. This one you would read this way. So you can easily just switch it up. So you can see here, so where I'm saying you keep the same stitch count. So this one this is a decrease because we've skipped stitches. And this one is an increase where we've increased, but you can see we've skipped 2, we're increasing 2, we're skipping 2, we're increasing 2. This is skipping 2 and increasing 2. And then you've got an increase on the end as well. So you've got 1 increase on each end. And you'll also quite often see this part where they've got the stitch pattern repeat. So if you had a chart that you found on the internet and you wanted to create because you thought it looked pretty cool, then this part here is the part that you would keep remembering. So you would start with this, you'd get to where this dashed line is, and this is the part you would keep repeating however many times you needed to repeat it. And then you would finish off with that. So if you wanted to work out your stitch count, then you would count how many stitches are in this. So you've got, if you go down this side, you've got this chain. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So essentially you're doing multiples of 12, and then you would add in whatever these chains are. You might find that these are multiples of, yeah, that's 6. That's 6. So you could continue with multiples of 12 for however many you needed, and then you would add the 3 for the turning chain. You might have to play around with it a bit, and certainly if you end up with a chain count that's too short at the start, I have always added stitches to the end, or I've just left them hanging. I'm fine with that as well. It all gets tucked in later. All right, so with this, you're going to start at this end, work your way across, and then when you start, you just work your way back. So a bit like the left-handed, when they're working the rounds, have to read it backwards, you just have to read it backwards as well. It's really as simple as that. So I think a lot of people in the end will find that reading a chart can be simpler than reading the words, especially some people with how they write their patterns. They have a lot of assumed knowledge in them. So if you're not understanding the pattern, don't think that it is you necessarily. I know I've messed patterns up. So if you see with this one, if you wanted to practice with making this one, so you'd be working 1 double crochet into each of those chains. You'd be skipping 2, and then you've got these 5, chain 2 for your increase. So you can use this as a practice and just see. Okay, so that's really all there is for today. So rows are a little less complicated than rounds. You've got less things to remember. Biggest thing is just to remember to keep your stitch count the same, and there's easy ways to fudge it. So like I've mentioned, add in a stitch somewhere, join stitches together, because it's really the overall stitch count that needs to stay the same. Okay, so tomorrow we're going to play with some texture, and I will show you some fun little stitches for what you can use texture. Some, well, I'll call them special stitches because they combine things, and some are just a stitch pattern where you mess around with your basic stitches, which is my actual favorite way to make some texture. So yeah, go and have some fun playing around with some rows, make some swatches, play around with the different stitches, see how straight an edge you can get. Practice as you get further into them. You will start, like I do find that even now sometimes rows can be a little bit difficult to count. You've just got to look for the pattern to it, so you can see you do end up with a right side and a wrong side. So the only time, so when you're working in rows, that's something I'll highlight. You've got clearer back. So if you look at this one, you might have to stare at a square for a while, but you can see that there is a difference. So this is the right side or the front, and this is the wrong side or the back. So you can see this looks a little bit more raised. But when you're working in rows, they do look the same on each side. The only time they're not going to look the same on each side is if you've got some like bubbles or popcorns that are working out on the front, which we'll work on popcorn tomorrow. And they'll tell you right and wrong side, but generally you won't see it. So you can see the rows, and even now I do find them harder to find the rows with the single crochet. So you're kind of just looking for the pattern, but just stare at it all for a while. You'll start to see the anatomy, like the single crochets. Where's my little swatches? So this one is the half doubles, but yeah, so you got 1. See, even now I still struggle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you can see one to me is easier to see than the other. So that one's flatter. This one's a little bit more raised just because of where it's working into. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Like the single crochet, I find it easier to count by 2s because it's clearer for me. So that's 1 row there, but this is 2 rows. So it's easier. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So easier to find the pattern. So just find whatever works for you when you're counting. Double crochets are much easier to count. Just work for the gaps. And some patterns, yeah, depends on the pattern as to how easy you'll find it. But just stare at them for a while. You'll start to see, I think, call it the anatomy of the stitch. So like anatomy in your human body, you've got anatomy of the stitch. So I should also say when you're working into the stitches, and we'll cover this more when we're making them on day 5, you want to insert under that V there. I do see that people tend to work in between the posts because it's easier, and that's okay, but that's just ends up being another way to make variations. Is it similar to making the hexagon square? Yes. I'm not sure what you're referring to as similar. Oh, you're meaning for this? Yes, so hexagons, all you're doing is you're adding in more corners, if that makes sense, to a square. I'm not sure what you mean to making the hexagon. I might have missed where that came up, where you're saying it's similar. I'm assuming here. So you don't have so if you're making the hexagon, you don't have decreases. You've only got the increases. You've just got more increases. Yeah, so no, this one will be a zigzag. I don't have a hexagon pattern. I've got a hexagon. So yeah, so hexagon, consider it more working in the rounds. And your increases are more where your corners, or your increases are where your corners are. So they're a bit more defined than when you're working in a circle. So you'll find when you're working in a circle that it will start to take on a hexagon shape just because the increases are so evenly spaced. So you can even that out by just changing where you start the increase. But if you're actually making the hexagon shape, then this here, yes, so that would be an increase, but this would just continue around, but you're starting in the circle in the middle. It'd be easier if I had the pattern to show you with. But yeah. All right. So I think that is all that I have to cover today. So yeah, just stare at them, learn to count the stitches. So if you want to count the rows, remember if you've got the turning chain you're counting or not. This one has the turning chain that is a stitch. And quite often patterns will say, and I don't know why they say skip the first stitch, because essentially that is your first stitch, so you're not skipping anything. You get a little frustrated with those ones. But if you are using the turning chain, then just make sure you do work into that one. And you'll find it easier to not miss a stitch if you use call it a buffer turning chain, where it's a turning chain just to get you the height, but not counted as a stitch. All right. That is all that I have. I will be back tomorrow for playing around with creating texture. All right, have a good one. Bye.